Right, the next paper will be presented by Diego Melado Martinez. And Diego, he's an engineer for new media arts and new media arts restoration researcher. And he leads a freelance project called Help Me, I'm Famous. And he's a founder of the Digital Art Drive collection space. Diego, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me properly? Okay, then let me share my screen here. So first of all, I would like to thank Gunnar for the presentation and all the people, all the staff at HKV for having me and giving me the chance to present the approach of the studio to documentation. Today, I'm going to talk about how the studio that I work with, the studio from Daniel Canogar, approaches documentation in order to conserve the artworks that we produce in the studio. It's a great pleasure and honor to be presenting among many top pros in the field, many of which have been inspiration, teachers, and support while trying to research in this field. Some of them for a long time. I think that I met Martina for the first time back in 2015. Getting into the presentation, if we're going to talk about the documentation from the studio of Daniel Canogar, from the studio Daniel Canogar, let me first briefly introduce his work and the studio. So this is part of the webpage from Daniel Canogar. And Daniel Canogar is a half Spanish, half US artist, working with new media for more than 30 years now, starting with photography, with digital photography, and trying to break with the idea of the flat square image by the means of either projections, computer-generated content, and flexible screens. Lately, most of his work has been relaying into two main legs, flexible LED screens like this we can see here, or like the latest work that we have been presenting in Expo 2020 in Dynamo, or the use of real-time data to generate algorithmic animations. I will be using one of his latest data works, Red, as an example during the rest of the presentation, but I will get into the details of that artwork later. But the studio is basically the people that make the studio work. Right now, we are up to 12 people working from 2 different studios in 2 different locations. A sudden growth, because since 2017, when we were just 3 people working, today we are still trying to handle this new amount of people. One of the last person that joined the studio is Marta, right here, from whom I will be talking a little bit later. Who is in charge of the documentation of the process inside of the studio. And me, I'm the project manager and engineer in the studio. Putting words to that can be a little bit challenging, so I'd rather gather some images of what I've been doing for the studio in this last 12 years. So basically can be summarized in plugging cables together and operating man lifts from time to time. Jokes apart, my work as my background as engineering is basically technical, and it's about turning Daniel's idea into technical means, into technical solutions that could work. For some years now, encouraged by the needs of the studio itself, I started researching in the conservation of new media, but always from a very, very technical perspective, from my engineering background. And something that I really enjoy is facing this approach with conservation professionals like you or like artists who can provide a different point of view, arguing if the practice that we are taking, it's valid or not, or why different points of view could be interesting. But enough of talking about me. So let's go a little bit more about the documentation of the studio, the actual point of this presentation. The motto of this conference is Contemporary Art Conservation Revisited 20 years later. I wanted to look back a little bit on what was the documentation that we from the studio were providing back in 2010, which was basically this. 3 pages of instructions on how to set up and how to turn on and off the artwork. Something that I think that is still very common in this kind of new media, technical, complex artwork. Something that quickly developed into more detailed manuals that started to be something else than just set up and startup manuals to introduce description of the artwork, and that today has expanded even more to include as much information as we could provide about a working context of the artwork. And that we are still trying to expand even more with more different media, basing our documentation in web pages, in videos, different archiving formats, even trying to make some sense out of the noise of recent technologies that could work for documentation and conservation, or could help gather information from different contributors to the artwork. So what has changed in those 10 years? Why we have stopped providing 3 pages of documentation and now we're trying to provide all of this? Basically, these 3 elements: awareness, demands, and resources. Awareness understood as a better comprehension from inside of the studio of the needs of what is a proper documentation that would allow for future conservation. Demands from institutions, and in our case, mostly from private collectors, that required for a better understanding of how the artwork works and how it should be taken care of. And actually the resources that the studio can use. When we were just 3 people working on the studio, it was something that we could not imagine, being able to produce such an amount of documentation. Now it's something that still is very resource consuming, but we understand that it's something that is very much needed. It's not difficult to understand that producing the right documentation is a task that consumes a lot of resources in the studio, which in some senses prevents the studio from doing its main task, which is creating art, which could also open a discussion about who and how should be producing this documentation. From the studio's end, the main tool that we use is the manual. Again, all the documentation that we produce and that we provide has a very technical approach, according to the studio practice or the studio mentality, that what is more important for us is to get the artwork working. So the manual. Right now, as I was saying before, the manual is more than a simple set of instructions, but a document that tries to provide a comprehensive description of the artwork in the terms of its significant properties. So if you let me show you, for example, the manual of SRED. SRED is a data work, one of these data work series from Daniel that uses real-time data. In this case, it's using NFTs taken from Foundation webpage to deconstruct them, to make this kind of textile breaking up apart animation. So this is the usual template that we use for manuals, where we have some artist bio, description, installation, all this index. If I can show you. So it's basically to provide some context on the artist bio, on what the artwork is, general information on thumbstampable materials and sizes, of course, installation, how to run the artwork, how to operate it, how to run through useful problems, how can you use the provided information to reinstall or recreate the artwork, some notes on describing the artwork itself and how to conserve it, and a very important part of the manual for us, a description of the artwork. I get into more details just in a minute. Also, the inventory and the part of the artwork, and some information on the warranty that we provide after the sale. So to represent the artwork in these terms that I was telling before, we use system theory, or theory of systems from an engineering approach. So briefly, what is a system? A system is a set of elements and their relation amongst themselves in order to fulfill a determined task. If those elements and their relations are properly defined inside of the context of the artwork, then the restoration, modification, or substitution of those parts could be easier to accomplish. Nothing new, as many of the previous speakers have already shown in their presentations. So the use of system theory is more or less straightforward when talking about the tangible elements of the artwork, those elements that I can see, that I can confront. For example, in the case of SRED, those elements are basically these 4: a screen where the result is shown, a computer that actually runs the algorithm that generates the animation, a keyboard who provides some kind of iteration, and the internet, well, where we get the data in real time. Again, from these technical Googles that I'm trying to use, that I'm looking through to look at the artwork, these elements make the artwork happen, but they are not the artwork itself. Especially in the case of the computer, it's just a way of making the algorithm that generates the artwork work. And in the same sense that or in the same way that we are using this systematic approach to describe the artwork or the tangible elements of the artwork, we could do the same with the algorithm that is being executed. In this case, instead of using the previous diagrams, probably we should be referring to flowcharts, as has been done for decades in process description in informatics and other processes. Something that we like highlighting in the studio is the general abstract value of these diagrams. In software-based art, it's very common to request or to consider the source code as the most fundamental way of representing the artwork, similar to a recipe. Source code is also part of the documentation that we deliver, and it will be kind of naive to think that just with the flowcharts that I was showing before, it will be possible to restore the original aesthetics of the artwork. Together, flowchart and source code, like I am showing in this image right now, can provide a much better understanding of the algorithm. But as we can see in this slide, source code is very much dependent on the environment where it was developed. The programming environment used, in this case, it was Visual Studio, the programming language, in this case, C++, or even the operating system, Windows 10 here, are elements that impact in the way the documentation is gathered, but again, from the artist studio perspective, has not an aesthetical value, has not aesthetical impact, and could be modified. I can totally understand that the environment can have other values, like historical value, understanding how things were done at a given time and why it is also a very important matter. But in this case, our highest concern is to be able to experience the artwork, to keep it running, which again could not be the main goal of other institutions or collectors. Here also, as part of the description of the artwork, as an instruction of the manual that I was sharing before, we have the inventory of the tangible elements, but also we provide a USB drive with all this environment, all the source code, all the different programs and external dependencies that the artwork could need. So up to this point, what we have achieved, or what we are trying to achieve at least, is a full description of the algorithm and the machine. But what happens when the limits of the artwork overflow the limits of the tangible? For example, when a significant property of the artwork lies beyond those elements that I'm actually confronting, like data sources. When those boundaries are diffuse, as defined by Dragon Spanshot, it is difficult to suggest substitutions or alternatives that do not mean altering the significant properties of the artwork. In the case of Shred, its algorithm is retrieving in real time the images of the newest NFTs uploaded to Foundation platform. Being Foundation, the platform, the data source, is a significant property. It could not be any other for this specific artwork. So what would happen if that source is no longer available for whatever reason, even if it's just a temporary lack of connection? Since collections, and especially collectors, private collectors, don't like big black screens sitting in their living rooms, we needed to find a solution for that. Instead of not running the algorithm, instead of just stopping the artwork, what we use is a local backup. While the artwork can still retrieve information from the data source, when the data source is still available, it stores a part of it, hence self-documenting itself. When the source is no longer available, the algorithm automatically starts using those stored images, which for the algorithm are exactly the same that if being retrieved in real time. The only difference, which for our case is a very big difference, this is altering a significant element of the artwork, is that those images are not being retrieved in real time. They are not representing how the artwork, they are not representing how the artwork was at a given time, the time when those assets were downloaded. And in that sense, what is documentation of an artwork but a representation of how the artwork was? Usually documentation is captured in a different media than the artwork itself, like a video of a performance, for example. But in this case, it is the artwork, the one showing the documentation. So artwork and documentation are almost indistinguishable, but still they are different. And that's why we stopped calling artwork to the artwork and considering that it has entered this Minish mode that we call the demo mode, referring to the demo scene in informatics and video games of the 80s and 90s. Not the same, but a pretty similar experience. This idea of self-documentation used as demo mode or in other different ways is not new and has been extensively used before by other artists. Here just some examples like Jose Carlos Martinez Brutalismo, Ernest Egmont Shaping Space of Rafael Lozano Henner Pulse Index. I'm not getting into details because time is running. So far we have defined what the artwork is, or at least what was at a given time. And very much from this technical make it to worker perspective. But talking about this perspective with artist David Rugby, he highlighted that this approach could replicate an artwork, but will ignore the process of creating, how the artist or how the studio lead it or arrive to that representations, how the artwork turned out to be what actually is. And that is where we are trying to take documentation in the studio and where Marta, who I was presenting before, enters into the process. She's constantly documenting the process inside of the studio, taking pictures, making video, and summarizing the information of what is happening inside of the studio, even encourages us to do the same. Which takes me to the last resource we are trying to implement in the studio. Still not working. The approach to documentation that we are envisioning is more related to the wiki concept, where different contributors could add information in a structured way that could make understand the artwork from different perspectives, not only technical, but also conceptually and historically. So very quickly, the conclusions of what documentation means to the studio could be that documentation is serious stuff, and we really need to take care of it. It takes a lot of effort, and it's probably not enough. And probably in the future, we'll be facing different problems, but probably is the best that we can do now. And the best that we can do now is for sure the best. It's also interesting to reflect in the fact that we are kind of an exceptional studio in the sense that not many artists can have the chance of having 12 different people working inside of the practice and with very different approaches. So what is the case of those who cannot afford this, who don't have the resources? I would like to bring this question again, as I was saying at the beginning, since gathering documentation demands a lot of effort from the studio and prevents us from doing art. And we'd like to throw the question among my mates or archival conservators on how institutions could help and how artist practice could help institution on making the gathering of this documentation of this information easier. And that's all. Thanks a lot.